Hello, today I'm going to be showing you how I did this drawing of a waterfall. Let's start. I'm going to be working on this piece of drawing paper which is about 9 times 12 inches in size. Starting out with a sketch, and I'm using a Stadler graphite pencil as usual for the sketch. The waterfall itself is going to be around here in the middle, and the tree line above it will be about 1/4 of the height of the paper. The paper is secured with a tape, and if you may have noticed, I am going to play some nature sounds in the background instead of the music. I thought it might be appropriate. Now what I'm doing is I'm shading the sky a little bit with a graphite pencil, and I'm going to be drawing clouds with an eraser. But first I need to make this portion of the paper a little bit darker, and the reason why I'm using a graphite pencil instead of the charcoal pencil is because I want it to be blended very smoothly, and I think that with graphite pencil, when you want light smooth areas, they work better than charcoal pencils because there is less texture. So I'm blending that in with a Q-tip and later with a brush, and now I'm starting to pull some highlights and draw some clouds with a kneaded eraser. I'm just lifting up a little bit of that graphite with the kneaded eraser, and then I'm refining the edges with a pencil eraser. I may be adding a little bit of value here and there and trying to enhance that contrast a little bit. But now I'm going to grab this charcoal pencil, and it's a soft woodless charcoal pencil, and I'm going to start to work on that tree line. I'm using the same approach I always use when drawing trees, and I've talked about this a lot in many of my previous videos. I like to make short, irregular strokes that almost look like scribbling. And the reason why I stress that they need to be short is because you don't want to create lines, you want to create something that will look like a texture of tree canopies seen from a distance. This is going to be the beginning of the waterfall there. But now back to these trees. So I'm going to start lightly near the top and then add some of these darker areas as I go lower to the closer to the river. The area around the waterfall is going to have some thick dark foliage, so that's going to be very dark, and it's going to give me a lot of contrast. The contrast between the white filmy water of the waterfall and the dark foliage in the shadows around it. I'm also making a few suggestions of branches and tree trunks here and there, so I'm not going to be drawing all leaves. So I'm making this area a little bit darker and adding some of these darker areas here and there. And later I'm going to be blending that, so it doesn't really matter how it looks right now, but it is important not to make long strokes, because then the texture won't look convincing, it won't look realistic. So I added just a little bit more value to the sky over there, and I can see now that I am going to need to refine the clouds, and I'm going to need more contrast there. Anyway, now I grabbed one of my tortillions, and these are homemade tortillions. I make these myself, and I find that they work better. They are very good blending tools, and I'm using it as I would a pencil, but I'm using it to spread the charcoal around, to soften this texture, subdue it a little bit, and to add a little bit of value to these white spaces in between, because I don't want it to look like a lot of black and white noise. Right now it's a little bit too grainy. But I'm also using a circular short scribbling motion when I'm going over these leaves. And I'm doing the same thing with a brush. This is a soft synthetic brush. And I don't know if you can see it, but I'm mostly using a circular motion. I don't want to go left and right. Most of the time I'm just using shorter strokes because I want to keep some of that texture, and I also want to keep some of these darker areas, and I'm refining them as I go along. The thing is, and if you worked with tortillions, you'll notice this, you can also use blending tools for lifting up some of the charcoal, for making areas lighter, because a dirty tortillion that has a lot of charcoal on it will tend to make things darker, but as you work and as that charcoal wears off, it tends to pick up some of that value and make some of these areas lighter. This is very useful when working on something like trees, because it allows me to just sort of vary the amount of value in certain areas and make certain suggestions of darker and lighter areas in between these segments or clusters of leaves, so that I don't have to go right away and start drawing highlights with an eraser. I can do that a little bit later. You can see that just by using the blending tools I will already make some suggestions of the shape and the volume of trees, and then I'll use the eraser for the final touches. Here I'm moving on to the other part of this tree line, and these are just above the waterfall, and again I made a few suggestions of branches here and there, and I'm going to be blending that as well. Here I'm making a suggestion of a hill or something, or a mountain in the back. I did that with my tortillion. So I'm just going over some of these the tops of the canopies and softening them a little bit. I don't want the edges to be too hard, and I don't want the texture to be too grainy. Occasionally I can use a Q-tip or a brush if I want to add more value overall, because you should leave those white spaces very sparingly. You want to create an appearance of very thick, or rather I want to create an appearance of very thick canopies here in this particular case. So I'm going to leave very few of these white spaces where the light and the sky is coming through. The rest I want shaded properly, and I want a little bit more darker value everywhere. So now the waterfall, like I said, will be here, and the bottom of it is going to need to be a little bit foamy and wavy. So I'm using my charcoal pencil to create some suggestions of these ripples and of that foam. And I think that the charcoal pencil is good for that because it allows me to create very regular shapes that kind of look real and organic. But what I'm doing now is one of the key things when drawing flowing water and waterfalls is I'm drawing in these dark spaces in between the water, creating areas of high contrast. But what these darker areas are, in fact, they are rocks around which the water flows. So I want to create an illusion that the water is flowing and dropping over these rocks and going around some of the more jagged or protruded ones. Keeping in mind that it does have to have kind of a foamy, irregular texture, and adding some more suggestions of these ripples and waves at the bottom. Then I can grab a tortillon to just soften that texture a little bit here and there, and maybe add some of the lighter areas which aren't quite black or quite as dark. I'm very gently blending it with a brush because this doesn't need to be completely white. In fact, because it's in the shadow of those trees, it's going to be a little bit darker. So you can see that I'm doing my best to make it look like it's flowing water, like it's dropping from a height, and adding a little bit more texture with a pencil where I feel texture is needed, and trying to add a few of these splashing bits here and there. Now I'm gonna shade the water here. The water in this part will be closer to the bottom of the paper, is going to be a little bit more still and less wavy, but I will be adding some highlights in there as well. I used a little bit of wine charcoal here to add a little more value, but wine charcoal is easy to blend and remove also, so I need it here because I'm going to be adding some highlights to that water there. This is supposed to be the shadow from those trees. The light source is coming sort of from above and slightly behind those trees. I'm also adding some of these darker areas in between these ripples at the bottom. And also I have to try to make the sides like this, to make the sides a little bit darker than the top areas, because the light is coming from above, so the top of these rocks is going to receive more light. So you can't just leave the white spaces and expect it to look like a realistic waterfall. A lot more work and planning is needed. everything has its shape and volume and lighting, and we always have to keep in mind where the light source is. So I'm just adding some of these thinner white lines, trying to make it look like water is trickling down these rocks. Now I'm using a pencil eraser to refine the appearance of the canopies and adding some highlights to the leaves, trying to remove a little bit of that dark value here and there whenever possible, but not trying to push it because I don't really need that much contrast. All I need to do is make certain areas a little bit lighter so that I can suggest certain shapes, because trees are complex and their canopies are complex. They consist of multiple segments, these clusters of leaves which grow around branches. So that's kind of what I'm trying to achieve. Just adding a few of these highlights to make it look like some of them are sticking out and getting more light from above. And some of these darker areas are recessed deeper into the canopy and they're getting less light. They are further away from the light source. Now, again, with a pencil eraser, I'm trying to add a few highlights to the surface of the water to make it look a little more realistic. To make it look like the water is reflecting light here and there. Adding a few more of these thinner white lines to make it look like water is trickling down, and just cleaning up some of these top areas on top of these individual rocks to make them a little bit lighter and the sides a little bit darker, and so that we are consistent with the light source. So far so good. This left side of the waterfall looks pretty good, but there's still a lot more work to be done on the trees to the right as well as the rest of the waterfall. I sometimes put a reference photo in some of these drawing tutorials, but here I don't have a single reference photo. I worked off a couple of them. So we'll just have to do without it. The trees here are going to be a little bit lighter. They're getting a little more light, but also their lower part is going to be a lot darker because it's kind of overhanging over the waterfall, and it's growing really low over that right side of the waterfall. But even though I'm going to be using the same approach here, I will try to make this area a little bit lighter. So I'm using maybe just a little less pressure, and when the time comes for drawing highlights, maybe I'll just lift up a little bit more charcoal. So now I need to add some more of these darker areas to suggest that there are some rocks in between these streams, in between these streams of water. And I'm just randomly adding a few of these darker areas here and there to make it look like the water is breaking around them. And cascading. So some of them are falling, some of the water is falling all the way from above, and in some other cases it's hitting some of the rocks which are halfway down and then flowing down the sides. You can just use your imagination here and modify the appearance of the waterfall as you like it. You're not going to be able to make it look like a reference photo anyway, not unless you spend dozens of hours working on it, obviously, which is not much fun. So I have to soften this texture here on these trees and add a little more value and volume and thickness. I'm working with my brush and my tortillions, and now again I'm working on the waterfall, trying to soften some of these darker areas with the tortillion and maybe add a few of these darker patches here and there using nothing but the tortillion. I want some of them lighter. Sometimes I want a little less contrast, sometimes a little more. I want this area here to be a little bit lighter, and the leaves above it, the trees above it, to be a little bit lighter as well. Even though it does look a little bit darker now, but it's going to be lighter when I draw some highlights. Again, I'm going over the tops of the trees with my tortillion a little bit to soften them. I don't want the edges to be too jagged, because when viewed from a distance they do look a little bit softer and almost kind of blurry. But I'm not going to be removing all of the texture, because I do love textures, and I believe that drawings should have a lot of texture to entertain the eye. Makes them look a lot more interesting and a lot more realistic. So right now I'm just trying to figure out what the right side of the waterfall will look like. There will be some darker areas to the right, but I will throw in a little bit of flowing water there as well. And then there will be one large rock on the side to the right. Here I'm adding some foliage there just above the waterfall. Trying to work on the texture of the water, trying to make it look a little more filmy. Of course, the pencil eraser can't always pick up very clean dots and clean edges, because some of the charcoal is buried into the paper. But I'm doing my best, and I don't need it to be completely white anyway. Adding a few whiter lines here and there. And now I'm going to use a kneaded eraser to lift up some of the value, some of the charcoal on these trees here, because like I said, I do want this part to be a little bit lighter. And the part of the waterfall just under it is also lighter, so you can imagine that light is coming through and this part is getting more light from above. So here on the side we're going to have another large rock, and there's going to be water flowing down it as well, and then there's going to be like a large foamy area here, and the other bank is going to be in the lower right portion of the drain. Here I grabbed a white gel pen to add a few of these white dots, but you can see that I don't want to leave them completely white. I'm immediately subduing them with a brush so that I can sort of blend them into the background and integrate them a little bit so that they don't stand out too much. But the reason why I used the gel pen was to enhance the texture of the waterfall, and because here and there I wanted to create these dots with a little bit cleaner edge. So you can't really see that many of them, but I don't need that many of them. It's just a few suggestions here and there. The eye will pick up on it. So maybe we can have a little bit more water there. And now finally I feel like I need to move on with these trees and make them look a little bit better. But first I need to add some of these darker areas with a charcoal pencil to separate some of these segments and make it look like some of them are behind the other ones. So once I do that, I blend it in. Maybe add a few more darker areas. And I blend. And then I can draw a few highlights here with a pencil eraser. I felt like the sky didn't look that good because there wasn't enough contrast between the clouds and the sky, so I decided to add a little more value and maybe change the shape of the clouds a little bit. I want them to stand out a little bit more. So I'm still working on these trees, adding some leaves and highlights. You can see how complex these trees look, but it didn't really take that much effort to achieve that. Here, like I said, I want this part of the water to be a little bit whiter and foamier. And there's going to be some water flowing down that rock as well. I could just add a few more of these darker areas here and there, but I think this portion of the waterfall already looks pretty good, so now just the just the rock to the right and a little bit more water flowing down it, and the waterfall is almost done. Now I'm drawing the rock here, and I'm trying to make its appearance look irregular and jagged. And in order to do that, I want to shade some of these areas a little bit more, make some of them darker and make the others lighter, so that it looks like it has very sharp angles, sharp edges. There's going to be some more foliage here to the right and some more rocks here. And once I finish that, the scene will be completed. But I need to add more texture and value to these bushes or whatever they are here, as well as to the rocks on the right. I can use my brush to soften these lines and those textures, and the rock will look a lot more realistic. And if I feel I need more contrast, I can always go back in with an eraser and clean up some of the upper portions of it, which are facing the sky. So these are going to be lighter, and the sides of course are going to be a lot darker. Adding some darker areas in this foamy part here. And then adding some lighter areas with a pencil eraser, as well as a few highlights here on this part with the water to the left. You can see me going over certain areas with a brush very gently here and there. That's because I don't want to leave them completely white. So it's good to have a lot of contrast, but generally you want to use your darkest black and your whitest white sparingly in your drawing. So I need to make this area a little bit darker so that these rocks at the bottom will stand out a little bit more. And I'm cleaning up their edges with a pencil eraser. I can't tell you exactly how long this took. I would have to check the raw footage, but I think it's probably no less than 5 hours. Because some of these parts require a little bit of patience. So I want to draw some highlights here on these bushes to the right to complete the scene. And now I'm working on some of the finer details, refining some of the details here and there. It's always good to move away from your drawing and see what else can be fixed. Not that it does need to be fixed, it just at this point I'm just adjusting things according to my liking. And I want this area of the water under the waterfall to be darker because of the trees, and I want the area to the right to be lighter. So when I want to make something just slightly darker without losing the texture and shape, I can just go over it with a soft brush, and you can see that I'm going over some of these areas at the bottom and making them a little bit darker. So now I'm going to remove the tape and spray it with a little bit of fixative, and then we'll see what it looks like. I've sprayed it with fixative and removed the tape. For some people that's a satisfying part of the process. For me it can be a little bit frustrating. But this is what the drawing looks like, and now I need to sign it. I need to decide whether to sign it to the left or to the right. To the right where the rocks are, or here to the left. The bottom left corner. This will be fine. So that's the finished drawing. It's a nice little scene. Zooming in a little bit. There we go. Now that the drawing is done, just a few final words on how to draw a waterfall, and this is what I've already talked about during the video, but I think the key to drawing a convincing looking waterfall is the contrast between these darker and lighter areas. What we want to achieve is make it look like water is flowing and dropping around these rocks, finding its way in between the rocks, because wherever there is this dark space, we can imagine that this is a protruded rock that the water has to flow around. Also, another important thing to remember is that because of the light source, some of the areas will be lighter than others, so these parts on top will be a little bit lighter, and these areas here on the sides will be a little bit darker. So these are some of the key points that you have to apply when drawing a waterfall. And as for the other things, we just have to do your best to imitate the texture of foamy flowing water. And that's all for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.